Hi everyone, my name's Jiapsi. I'm Yoeme Guaran, but born and raised on Kumeyaay lands. I am from Logan Heights, that's my neighborhood. And right now I'm involved with the POC Fungi Community and a group called the Tierras Indígenas Community Land Trust. Um, I focus my energy around ecological education, environmental education, and the land trust is a lot of like land back kind of work. We're trying to reclaim land and prevent gentrification and also support um, a healthier environment in a predominantly brown and low income community. Um, I'll talk more about it throughout the conversations, but that's some of the work that I do.
Yeah, and then we'll just move on.
Do you want to
Or
introduce yourself?
oh, I guess we should do that too. Huh? I'm Doa, as you know by now. I One thing about me is that I'm an anthropology PhD student at UCLA currently. But my connection to this community and the reason I'm here actually goes back to the Newman Mycology Summit, where I met Mario and Patricia and their kids, and I painted their faces in 2018. And then I happened to come out here for the program, but because we were already connected, they've been so welcoming and given me a family here. Like I said, I'm from Turkey. A lot of my family's still there, and so it's been really amazing to have this community and these relations. And Juana too. We met in 2018, and Yapsi, I think we met in 2019. So anyway, yeah, a lot of our connections go back to mushroom organizing, and it's just incredible to share this space with you. There's probably other things, but we'll talk.
I'm Shanhuan, and yeah, I met Doa and Jiapsi and Mario and Juana um, at New Moon this year, or last year, I guess that was last year now. And yeah, I guess I was drawn to New Moon because I'm a filmmaker and storyteller, and I'm always interested in the ways that story has the power to like shape the world, and especially interested in the ways of like what happens when communities take back the power in telling stories. Um, so New Moon was especially potent place for that kind of work that's happening. Um, so yeah, that's why I'm here.
My name's Christian. I'm from San Diego originally, but I've been living in Central California up in Santa Cruz for the past 17 years and moved back this summer. And so I'm sort of like rediscovering San Diego as an adult instead of a high school kid. Um, and I'm here because I met Olga in 2021 and we did adventures in New York and in Greece, and she introduced me to all these folks. So I'm happy to meet a lot of these people for the first time, even though I've known some of you online for a long time. But I'm happy to be here. Oh, and I study mushrooms.
I never know what to say for these sections. My name is Bianca. I'm a mother. I'm a farmer. I grew up in the Imperial Valley on the border. And I studied in Florida, Miami for 10 years. And then moved back to San Diego area when Maya was born about a decade ago now. And I'm a founder of a nonprofit called Botanical Community Development Initiatives, or BCDI. And the basis of it is really like a lot of what we're talking about today. I think that I was on a track for academia, and I really enjoyed plant taxonomy, and I was really good at the classes and learning the names, and I was also taking all of these agricultural classes, and I realized there was such a schism, right? Like a separation of knowledge, right? This knowledge was seemingly locked up in the ivory tower, but I was learning a lot from my professors and in the classroom, but it was really when I was outside with people who knew the plants or who had been farming the land and had been there, watching the animals and every single day and could tell me these minute detail about these things. Some of them were the professors, right? Some of them are out in the field and outside. Some of them were just people who were, just knowledge keepers or farmers and had been just looking for a long time. And so that really drew me into, I think more community work and really asking this question, right? Like, how do we uplift our knowledge, right? And how to create this bridge of knowledge of academia where this knowledge is seemingly locked up to our, all of this other knowledge, which is even grander outside of it, and create, I don't know if bridge is the right word. I'm curious, as this conversation goes on, like what that looks like. Is it an interweaving? I'm not sure. But that's kind of my work and what centers a lot of my work. And I'm just really happy to be here and have this conversation with y'all. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you wanna?
Yeah. I guess I'm sort of facilitating this conversation.
Christian, you want to scoot this?
Oh.
Oh, I don't know if that's scoot. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so I wonder, like, we've heard a little bit about some of the community science practices, but I was wondering if maybe Jiapsi and Bianca and Christian, if you could all share a little bit more in detail, like what that looks like for you, like what is it day to day, like how are you interacting with community, and like what is the practice of community science look like for you?
What's up?
I think that science isn't just for academia. I think it can be outside of the institution. I think that we're all have the ability to do that. I'm raising my daughter and I've seen, like observation skills. It's innate in us, right? And certainly there are ways to teach observation skills, right? Like how do we listen? What are we looking for in patterns when we're listening to the birds, or when we're looking at the plants, or how the patterns in the rocks, which I'm learning about. Um, and so I think for me, it's about strengthening our knowledge as community members, for us to be able to contribute our knowledge as community members, and I think it's the role of academia and institutions to also acknowledge this, right, and to interweave this into the knowledge, and not the other way around. Like we shouldn't be pleading with these institutions to listen to us. I think that these institutions need to be pleading with, like, how do we interweave and do these things. And so we have a Border BioBlitz project that we work on. This is our 6th year doing it, and this is a cross-border project that goes from Tijuana all the way to Gulf of Mexico, and it was started in response to Trump's wall being built and this kind of lack of knowledge of biodiversity along the border area. So it was just a group of us that were like, how do we do this? So it was very grassroots, and we do partner with institutions, with the NAT, with universities and things like that, but it wasn't the institutions who started it. It was folks, right, that started it, and then we leveraged our relationships with the institutions instead of the other way around. So I think it's that, right? I think it's like it's acknowledging, teaching each other, knowledge sharing, knowing that we have relationships with our ecologies long before these institutions were established. So reclaiming that, yeah.
I guess I'll go next. My interaction with community science, that's definitely what I think of myself mostly doing these days, is various kinds of community science. And recently, that was teaching at UC Santa Cruz in a very academic setting. Well, not very academic, because I taught a class that the university didn't really want, because it was mostly about natural history in the sort of older sense, not really about doing any sort of cutting edge research, not using a lot of tools, really, mostly having it live in the seat of the senses. So anything that you can do with your body being sort of a more important tool set for doing what I wanted to do in my class. So although I got interested in biodiversity because I liked learning names, similar to what you experienced, it sounds like, and I was good at it, eventually I realized that what I liked most about it is that it was a way of honing my senses, my like way of interacting with the world, my
the things I was born with to be able to sort of touch and feel and smell the things around me. And that by teaching that to people, there was a repossession or reclaiming of something that this world seems to sort of be structured to dispossess us of, which is, our senses, being able to interact with the world that is there and not a virtual world, not a sort of augmented reality world. These are things that I am increasingly feeling resistant towards, and that natural history is a tool that is resistant to it. If you start to really care about earthy things and the way that your senses engage with them, you become more skeptical about what perhaps you're handed by. At UC Santa Cruz, for example, we're really close to Silicon Valley, and they are sort of moving the university away from natural history and towards gaming. They have a gaming major, they have virtual reality research there, and all of that is sort of a trajectory that I personally am explicitly resistant to, and hope that by teaching people about organisms and natural history, that they'll just sort of get the sense that that is a more important way to live than to live in a world that likes tools and analytical ways of engaging more. So I think I probably have more to say about the danger that names pose, but we'll get there, I think, at some point.
My nerves just hit me all of a sudden. So science itself is a lot older than its own name. So the way that indigenous cultures interact with their environments and understanding selective breeding, those are processes of observation and interaction. And that's one of the things that I love about science in general, is that it's an interactive activity. And like you were saying too, and when you have a lot of time on your hands, you can't help but to interact and to observe with your environment. But in terms of community, Logan Heights, my neighborhood, we have the highest quantity of air pollutants in our neighborhoods. We have the 5 freeway that intersects our neighborhood. We have the San Diego port, or Port of San Diego, that thousands of diesel trucks come in and out to get to. We have the Navy, the naval ports and the shipyards and all of that. So we're impacted by a lot of different environmental pollutants, and it's impacting our health, it's impacting our quality of life. So we can't help but to take our observations seriously, to take our environment seriously, and our circumstances. And for some of us, that's forcing us to become engaged with science. Even if it's not your entire passion, it happens to be mine. I love the sciences, but the community knows, or a lot of people in my community know what particulate matters are. Because they know that it's in our air. They know what an ozone layer is because ours is fucked up. So you learn a lot of these things by engaging with your community and understanding what's happening within your immediate environment. And the ways that in my life that I've been engaging with community and science is one, through POC Fungi Community, having those opportunities to educate about mycology and what bioremediation is, which is using organisms to help remove pollutants from the land, and just mycology in general. But with the Tierras Indígenas Community Land Trust, one of the things that we're trying to do through there is purchase empty lots to support more green spaces, and to find contaminated sites to practice bioremediation as an effective process of removing contaminants, instead of removing the soil and making it someone else's problem. And something that we did yesterday too, I wasn't able to make it to the event yesterday because I had class, and also because we were doing a phase 1 soil testing report on a piece of property that's being donated to the land trust. And that was an opportunity for community to engage with scientists with degrees, to understand what it means to make observations and collect data to see what your soil health looks like. And that's going to be a continuing process too. It's something we want to continue doing with community. But yeah, that's a lot of aspirations go into that, just cultivating mushrooms. A lot of people are interested in cultivating mushrooms. So that provides the opportunity for us to make growing kits and sharing with community and all that too. So it's not just like what you're absorbing for yourself and your own knowledge and your own growth, but it's also tapping into the excitement of sharing that knowledge and also like finding the people that you relate with. You know, that's a big part of it too. I'll keep going.
So we're gonna get a little more specific next and actually talk specifically about taxonomic naming practices. So what's your relationship to Western scientific naming practices, and do you use taxonomic classification in your work? I know you two talked about it a little bit. And also, do you think it's a good system, a functional system of representation and sharing knowledge?
Okay. Actually, I was thinking about this a lot during that conversation. Um, so I've taken some botany classes in soil science, agriculture, and stuff like that, and they will teach you and expect you to memorize botanical names, which is related to taxonomy. And so whenever I see that on the syllabus, my first response is to go to my professor and let them know that I don't give two shits about taxonomy, that they should not expect me to learn a second language or another language. Um, because I'm here for a particular science. I'm here to learn, you know, the relationship of these plants with the land and with myself as well. Um, but I also will concede that taxonomy is useful when tracking genetically, biologically. Like you can, through taxonomy, you can see like what plants are related to each other, like through those names and stuff. That's, in my opinion, that's like its only good use of like categorizing something, and it doesn't even have to be on that. Because another thing too is like if you understand the language of its original name, you can find out where it came from, you know? Um, so like I don't I don't prefer taxonomy. I would rather learn indigenous names of plants and fungi and other species. Um, the common names in your currently spoken language is also really helpful too. Like mule fat, you know, or eye of newt. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like Black Eyed Susan or something. I don't remember that one. Um, but yeah, those things can be really helpful. But in my opinion, like taxonomy, um, as brutal of a history as those things are, that's like the only use I can see like from it. Um, but I don't prefer it in my opinion. Yeah.
I use taxonomy every day. And I have published names in the style of Western taxonomy, and I use that to communicate to my students and to learn about ecology. And I think it is a really good system, and it is not the only system. And I think probably the most important thing to soothe yourself about, if this is worrying to you, is that scientists need to be humbled about the fact that they are not the only system. But some amount of the authority that we grant them is comes from us. Like we sort of yield too much territory because they appear to be authoritative. Um, and I think I was talking to this table about this earlier, but another thing that I maybe want to say in defense of taxonomy, and at least in the way that we're talking about it right now, is that it's one of the least sciencey things that happens in science. It's kind of a language that doesn't really involve a lot of experimental manipulation that's like the bread and butter of most of science. It is more like a language that is useful for a very niche desire, which is if you want to talk about the diversity of life on Earth, there are millions and millions and millions of species, and if you want to do that at scale with lots of people, and some of those people don't share your history or tradition, it's useful to have a name that isn't from anyone's individual tradition and becomes what we call standard, or ideally sort of outside of any sort of common derivation. When that becomes dangerous is when the idea that it's standard makes it more authoritative or more important. And that actually never had to be true. it became sort of granted in an unearned way because it feels fancy. And that it is literally that superficial, is because it sounds odd and because there's lots of syllables involved, people like sort of put a spell on themselves, thinking that somehow there is a grandiosity to it that means something. And like I was saying to this table earlier, I learned a lot about this before I ever went to the university. When I got there, it was a revelation to me that a lot of the professors who used taxonomy were not really that knowledgeable about the organisms they were referring to. And that's actually kind of comforting, because it means that the system is not synonymous with the people who use it. There are people who use those names and are experts in the way that we care about, because they spend time in the field and they know about the connections that organism has, not only to themselves, but to the other organisms around it. And it becomes a useful way to refer to, all of the non-human things that we share the planet with, many of which are like not things you're going to get a common name for from anybody's culture, because they're so tiny and they're very hard to even detect or interact with. But with a certain amount of care, they can rank in your world. They can become worthy of your attention and your love and your stewardship. And then you need some way to talk about it to the people around you. So I guess I'm probably the representative of the things need names, or at least it's really useful to have them, whether or not they need them. But I definitely don't want to pretend that I am in any way a defender of the broader project of science as being the most important way of knowing.
Can you say the question again? Because I have a million things that's rocketed off, and I just want to make sure I'm answering the question.
Yeah. What's your relationship to Western scientific naming practices? Do you use taxonomic classification in your work? And do you think it's a good system of representation and knowledge sharing?
Okay, big questions.
Yeah, it's a
All
lot.
Yes, I do use binomial taxonomy classification in my work as a field biologist, as a field botanist, even in agriculture. I took a lot of, my mentor in college was an ethnobotanist, and so I learned all the Latin names of lots of useful plants. And I think that, it's a system of knowing. Just like I think, like, I speak English. If you look at me, that's not what my ancestors spoke, you know? And so it's what was accessible to me, and one way to learn. I learned about patterns and how to identify things, and it allowed me to go to a place and become more acquainted in a way. Now, knowing the histories, we were having a conversation here just before we started this panel, like, really they should have, before I took my first taxonomy class, they should have given me the history, right, of how it came, how Linnaeus did this, and I had to learn this on my own later, right? And these ugly histories of the colonial histories of this, and the racist histories of it. And so um, I, I recognize that, echoing what you're saying too, having this like body of knowledge, having one name for an organism can be really helpful when you're thinking about medicines or toxins or things like that. I'll look on the back of my lotions, right, and I see Latin names on there, and I know what they are, and I know what these things, happen. And like common names can mean lots of different things. So sapote, depending on where you are in the world, can be lots of different things. And then even then, like, common names are also not always, necessarily the best. There are lots of racist and sexist terms in common names, right? And I just love, I think language is important, and I love, like, anybody who spent time with children outdoors, they come up with names for things outdoors, like the caterpillars, the insects, and the way they're so intimate, and that's valid too, right? And I love just hearing the different names of what people eat and what they call it, the different dishes, the different corns, the different fruits, right? And just hearing, and none of it's wrong, right? There's a million ways to plant the milpa, and they're all right, right? And so I think that there's space for all of these languages, and they all can serve certain things. And I think one of the things I learned or I think about by being an attorney's daughter is about how, we're in these systems and we live in these systems. And as an attorney, right, my father's role is interpreting these systems and navigating it. And just because they're there doesn't mean that's how it has to be, right? Like you can interpret it all these different ways. And so we live in capitalism, and we have this classification, the nomenclature, and how are we taking environment we have and making it so, interpreting it for ourselves and for our own uses. I was thinking today, I almost wore my, those like Mexican embroidery shirts, right? And they're made out of like, what are they made out of? Like polyester, right? Right. And so like, I was like, oh, here we are like reinterpreting, using the resources that we have, expressing our culture and expressing ourselves in those ways, and I think about this in capitalism too. And I'm not an economist, so I can't, I can only talk about my own experiences. Like, how are we interpreting this system for ourselves? How are we in the institutions we're inside and work with? How are we interpreting our roles within those institutions to create what it is that we want to create, right? And so we can know these names, we can leverage what they offer. But then, right, we need to become, if we're going to do that, we also need to be educated about how they cause disparities, right? How is this like white man culture, right? I was taught by these like white men botanists, right? And they were like almost like comparing penis sizes, how many names they knew, and it's so very competitive. And I know people can be competitive by nature, and sometimes it's fun. But at what point does it become so that people feel like they're not knowledgeable because they're around people that know Latin names, right? It's just like this flaunting of knowledge, right? You think about Paulo Freire, right? And that was his whole thing, right? You have, what is knowledge? It's your intimate, it's what you know. Nobody knows better than what you know, right? And nobody can take that away from you. Um, and so it's that. I think it's empowering ourselves, like you were saying, not giving them as much power to think that we can't do that. And those of us that can be interpreters, like, how do we be interpreters? How do we do that, and acknowledge those things? And I don't know if it's calling people out, but holding each other accountable. I like that better. Um, because I've also been, I've not perfect, right? And I've also mimicked my mentors before, and I catch myself, or and so how do we become aware, help each other to go the directions that we want to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do have a final thought about like the erasure of language. Um, I dropped a class that was called Kumeyaay Ethnoecology, and I went into it with the expectation of learning more about Kumeyaay botany, like the plants and the names of plants and stuff like that from the region. But it ended up becoming more taxonomy. So I ended up dropping the class because that was not my intent for absorbing knowledge in that class. Because I could learn that from any other botany class. So I just want to like call out the importance of highlighting indigenous languages for very specific times and settings too. Like yes, we can make botany classes with that standard and all of that, but I think it's important to make sure to preserve the native languages and the native names and stuff too, because their stories and their names also come with more data, more information about what that plant's relationship to you and the land is. Um, so yeah, I'm just expressing that disappointment and that desire for like more education around indigenous names and language. Because there's 12 bands north of the border, Kumeyaay bands, and there's very few language teachers or speakers for that matter. So just wanted to highlight that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like what's interesting thinking about everything that you all have shared is this idea um, of these like different systems of knowledge and like what are the conditions that produced them, right? Like if we think about taxonomy as arising from sort of the project of empire, and like how it's also currently sometimes being used by people who have sort of this mission of like capitalism, of like dividing everything up into like manageable and controllable entities, like putting things into categories, so we can just say from like a faraway place, like this field has too much of this particular organism in it, which therefore means it somehow doesn't match our production quota, or like is diseased because then we have to apply pesticides to it or something along those lines. And like I think that is where this project of community science is so important, right? Like if we are taking this understanding of like the different lineages of life that have brought us into this moment, um, and not only treating it from the perspective of like how do we categorize things into ways that give us more dominance or control, but like looking for that understanding and those relationships and interactions, um, then that maybe just opens up more possibility for, like one, respecting and like bringing these indigenous knowledge systems and older ways of knowing back into our life ways, and like the relationships, cultivating those relationships and tending to the land, but also, um, on a community level, like empowering ourselves to be in a position of like, oh, like not only can I use this knowledge, I can also be a bearer of the knowledge and share knowledge that maybe I have through my experiences, right? Like my observation of, um, these species interacting maybe hasn't been considered when people are managing fields through a more hierarchical system, um, or something like that. So I guess that brings me to the question for all of you is like, what other knowledge systems do you bring into your work, and what other ways of knowing are you exploring and learning about and teaching or, um, interacting with?
Um, so one of the things that I try to highlight in my work, I don't know if this like is on the nose or whatever, but in the community land trust, one of the things that I really try to highlight is the importance of ecology. And as humans, our relationship to ecology. Because when we look at environmental health, we're thinking just of plants and just of every other creature that is not a human. But returning to the fact that humans are a part of the ecology, the overall ecology, so that with the land trust, originally the idea was just to purchase lands to make more housing for more human dwelling. And that is important for our community. Anti-gentrification, having preventing displacement, and all of that is really important. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight within the group too was that like human beings shouldn't be the only life worth considering within our spaces. In Logan, I can't remember the last time I saw a lizard or a rabbit. I don't think I've ever seen a lizard or a rabbit in my neighborhood, but I know that they used to be there. So um, part of the mission is to try to restore the natural balance of the space, to have that other life, the other native forms of life from the space to return. Um, and so that's something that like I don't know if I'm straying away from the specific question.
That's okay.
But essentially like I think it's just thinking more of just ourselves, um, and like actually applying it day to day in our work, because it's easy to forget about the other life. We're so caught up in our own shit. Um, and I'll stop at that idea.
Yeah, definitely want to echo that because I think when I was a teenager here and I was just getting into it, it was all fun and interesting and cool, but I didn't know why I was doing it. I didn't have a reason for why I was doing it. And that has been a slow process of revealing itself to me over the past 20 years. Like, what is it about paying attention to organisms that has a resonance and a value to me? Why is it that I've stuck? Like, that is what my life is about. And pondering why that is. Why is it that my life has so tightly glued itself to non-human organisms? Because that's kind of strange compared to most of my peers. And I think the reasons that are becoming clear to me is that it helps me see around the limits of human culture, to pay attention to other organisms that for them, it doesn't matter what our perceptions of them are or what it is that we consider valuable about the world. They have their own lives and their own priorities, and they're fundamentally, unique and different from us. They're not part of our culture, and that softens the boundaries of what I am told to care about by my parents, by my job, by my boss, and it makes me feel free because I realize that I am just another organism on the planet, with a right to be here, just like they've got a right to be here, and to live on the surface of the planet, just like they've got a right to live on the surface of the planet. So I want to echo that point about paying attention to these other creatures being a freeing thing. It feels freeing because you realize that you're like them in that way. But I also, when I teach people, I guess incorporating other ways of knowing, this is a little silly, but that's the point. I tell my students that the first thing they should do when they encounter new organisms that they're trying to learn a name for is to learn some name first, not the name. And that can be their internal name, like their first reaction to it. Like I tell them to envision a little cartoon character. What personality does it have? Because that will make for a much richer sort of scaffold to relate to that organism for the next 90 years of your life. How did it feel to you the first time you saw it? Is it a funny mushroom? Is it an elegant mushroom? Is it very serious? Like those sorts of impressionistic reactions. That's a different way of knowing from what you're taught in a traditional taxonomy class. But I try and tell them that is what you should be doing if you're really going to get to know these creatures. So that is the difference between names and recognition is something that I don't know who was saying. You can go to a coffee shop and you're like, I know that regular. They're always here, but I don't know what their name is. And that's the gap between naming and recognition. And that recognition is really what I'm trying to instill in people, because that is the first handhold you need for what I actually care a lot more about, which is what you were saying, which is ecology. What is going on? Ecology is like by far the more important project for me. Naming is fun, but it's trivial. It is useful and valuable and good only in as much as it allows you to recognize what's happening on the stage. The names of the characters help you put together the plot of the play. And the plot of the play is really important because it's what all our lives are embedded in. It's what makes the food possible. It's what makes the shelter possible. It's what deranges our relationships with each other because we have messed with the plot. We have destabilized the ecology that we should have been embedded in. So for me, that's what the tool of naming serves is. And it's why it actually puts the limits on the tools of naming, because I don't need to know every last organism to get the broad strokes of what is going on ecologically. It starts to make sense, and I can sort of deprioritize the naming and start to pay attention to the larger patterns, the bigger picture of energy flow. So that was a lot of words. I'll pass it off now.
Say the question again.
Or
Yeah, it's just what other ways of knowing you work with and interact with or are currently learning and teaching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. um, it was me who said that about the not knowing people's name, forgetting people's names.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think one of the things is that happens is now that I'm not just doing Bonilla, I do a lot of other things. I'm running a nonprofit and we have a farm and I'm a mom and just a million things. So I'll forget names of organisms, of plants, right? But they're all in there. It's really easy for me to remember it. And but I remember we were just out on a walk last week and I couldn't remember a bunch of names, but I could tell you, I'm like, oh, I know this plant. And I'm thinking of one plant in particular. I was like, oh, I know right now if you touch it, it's soft. The hairs are soft and they're white and they get bigger and they get a little bit more gray and then they hurt and then it has these little white spots at this point. And I know already I could imagine how it smelled. And this kind of like intimacy of knowing something instead of just the names, or I see somebody, right? I meet you today and we had a conversation and I can remember how I felt around you. I can remember your smile. I can remember, different things. But I might not remember your name, but it doesn't mean like I didn't absorb it. I don't know it, and I feel that way. Like I know how to walk around the chaparral and the and scrub and I know how to listen for things. And I think that um, naming things are important, right? So one of the things we are talking about when I used to teach, to kids, oh, when you first meet somebody, what's the first thing you do? You learn their name, you ask them their name, and it is a beautiful thing, right? To have a name and to name it and to acknowledge it. Um, but it's not the only way. I don't say that anymore, because I've learned of all of the ways that we experience it, right? Like not everybody thinks in that way. First off, not everybody remembers words, or not everybody can speak. Um, and so, having these other modes of relationships are important to acknowledge those, and that we can share those experiences with each other. I also think that sometimes if people just focus on the naming and take away the relationship, it's so devoid of everything. And this happens not only in taxonomy, right? People who are sitting in herbariums all day, or maybe don't never seen the plant in person, right? There's people who study plants from another part of the world and they spend their whole lives in herbariums and have never actually seen the plant. And they're so stoked when they get to like go across the world and finally see the plant in person, right? And I see that, I see this in a lot of things. Like I know like a lot of herbalists, right, will do this too, where you'll find somebody who is really excited and they'll buy the plants from some company somewhere else, have it shipped to them, and they find a recipe online and then they bottle it up and sell it. And it's like there's no relationship, right? And so how do we center that relationship? And to me, that's the exciting part, right? Like, how do you cook this? How have you seen this? What words do you use for it? Oh, this happens here. If for those of you who have experiences tending land, whether that be a cuadrito in a community garden or your backyard, if you're there for a certain amount of time, there's a very like I would love to see, I don't know any research on this, but this very human experience of like how we're tied to it, like how emotionally tied we are to it. And anybody who's worked in community gardens, right? Like there's a lot of drama in community gardens. And I think it's tied to that. Because we feel so like it's a part of us. It's almost like an extension of us. So when somebody like does something to it without our permission or moves something or whatever, like it feels personal. Someone's gonna take away the community garden. It's personal, right? And it hits you like gutturally. Um, it's like a family member. It's yourself. It's your being. And so I think that's curious. Like in our minds, right? Like um, what is um, the neuroscience behind that? I'm just of how those things become a part of who we are. And I've been really invested in seed work these last few years, and I think that these relationships with the land and with the plants at Community Roots Farm, I've been there for 10 years, and I feel intimate with this place. But I think it was with the seeds, right? Because there's this relationship with not only the seeds, but then these seeds have these relationship with people. And it's probably like my most deeply spiritual experience, because I swear I can feel the seeds sometimes. I can feel the ancestors of the plants, of the people, and there's no way to measure that. I don't know, maybe I'm making this shit up, who knows. And does it matter, right? I'm still feeling it, and it's intimate to me. And okay, I can tell you the Latin names of those things, and I can do record keeping, and I can do spreadsheets, and we can talk about that, and we can talk about Vavilov's Center of Domestication. Like you want to, let's do that, right? And I think that there's just all these different ways of knowing, and I think it can be enriching. But I want to know, like Maya, like she runs around the farm and she sees like little details of things that are happening that I would have never have noticed. Like that's exciting to me. I want to know like the person that has been living on a mountain for for their generations of living on a mountain and the knowledge they know, and like that's magic, right? Like that sort of indigeneity of being so intimate with the place, whether in your lifetime or your generations have been there, and to not only know it so intimately, knowing when a certain sound of a bird comes out, like what does that mean during that season? But and then to feel like you're part of it now, like you're part of the ecosystem, like you're not a visitor anymore, right? Like you're intertwined with it. So I think that's what interests me, like these kinds of those other ways of knowing. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think
Thank you. No, that was really good.
It's okay. Keep running on the topic.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm inspired by both of y'all too, because y'all brought some really beautiful words into this. One of the things is like the mental health implications of ecology is one of the things I joke about with my TLT folks is that like the only reason why I'm doing it is because I want a garden. You know, like I've maintained community gardens since 2017, and every single garden I've maintained has been taken away from me or the people I've cultivated with. So there's a lot of trauma behind that, you know. Like even if I talk about it for too long, my heart gets all shaky, my voice shakes, because like it's really personal, you know. It's like my desire to be involved with nature and to cultivate healthy foods and medicines for myself, my family, and my community. And even learning about how like there's microbes in soils that have antidepressant properties. There are relationships that you have with the sounds of crickets, the sound of crashing waves and birds that unlock parts of your own DNA that's beneficial for you, you know, mental health and physically and all of that. So there's a lot of health implications of just being involved with your environment. And one of the things that I was inspired through that is like on one of our walks we saw a bunch of puffball mushrooms, and like it was really amazing to me how like the puffball mushroom spreads its spores by requiring action from another species. It does not spread its own spores. It has to be stepped on or pushed for its spores to be spread. So it's interactive like that. It's dependent on other life for its own life to sustain. So like that alone was really amazing, and like it was kind of affirming in the sense that like we're meant to interact with other life in order for life to continue because we're part of it, you know. It's the separation of division from that. And something I learned from my last soil science class that really like messed with my brain was the disruption of the nutrient cycle. Like in coastal regions, a lot of times our sewage gets sent out into the ocean, and that disrupts the nutrient cycle because you're pulling matter away from the land and you're pushing it somewhere else. So the nutrients that would have gone into the plants from your environment is now being put into the ocean. So I mean, there's a lot of implications behind that, but it just shows that like human culture has really disrupted the natural flow of life itself, and that's awkward, you know. And one of the things that like I really love about the involvements in indigenous culture and ecology, and just our relationship to other life is like there's a lot of creation stories that talk about us coming from the earth. There's a lot of creation stories that talk about the birth of the human being and how dependent we are on all the other life around us to receive the tools that we have from our eyesight, from our hearing, from our strength, and all those things coming from indigenous stories, you know? And so one of the things that tells me is that us as human beings owe everything that we have to everything else because it came from something outside of ourselves. We didn't just pick it up, we observed it, we learned, we grew, you know, and we owe that to everything else, everything that's not us. And with that, with healing these relationships by growing your own foods and medicines, that helps with your own self-pride too, to your own existence. It affirms your own existence, and I think that's really important as POC and people whose histories also coincide with genocides, you know, and like our existence is still very prominent, and so is like these knowledges, and it's important to keep them alive, you know. Yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so with that, I think we kind of want to open the discussion up to like the wider circle here too. And I was also curious, like along that context of, like the title of tonight's event is remediating our futures. So I'm curious to like for our panelists if like what your vision of the future is or of like remediation of the future is. Um, and like yeah, how do these all these different ways of knowing whether it's taxonomy or indigenous knowledge um, play into that? And maybe if y'all have experience or thoughts about that as well, please feel free to chime in.
I talked a lot, so.
I guess it's big, but yeah, I guess I do worry sometimes when I was still teaching. I stopped teaching at the university this past year because I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to be in that space anymore. I was starting to feel like I was time is running out in terms of getting people to realize the stakes of what the next 100 years are going to face us with. And I felt like I was still operating in a business as usual capacity when I was teaching at the university. And I started to just feel like I shouldn't be up here. You shouldn't be in this classroom. We shouldn't be in this space right now. Like the work is out there, not in here. And when I think about remediating the future, I often have a phrase in my head that everything is going to become retethered to what it always was supposed to be tethered to, which is sort of natural abundances, natural cycles, the fact that you can't have everything all the time, that the world should not be as convenient as we have insisted on it being all the time, and that retethering just will happen. That's just how ecology works. Like ecology will rebalance itself, and whether or not we like choose to get there the hard way or a more gentle way that's what I actually want to work on. Convincing my like fellow humans that we should do it gently and not just hit the sort of the limits of our arrogance as hard as possible. And so I don't know a lot. I don't know anything about how to live on the land in community. That is like one of the things I was dispossessed from growing up as like a modern American. And that is going to be a really disadvantaged position to be in if the world sort of like becomes balanced again, because I won't know how to do it. I won't know how to be like an organism. I won't know how to have community on the planet. I won't know how to live with people. So I think that has made, for me, the awareness that like traditional ecological knowledges are not abstract. They are going to be the most important thing for anyone to have exposure to in the coming 200 years. Like if you know some of that, you're going to be in a much better place to be alive and be a valuable person to your community than if all you ever did was, study DNA sequencing. Because no one's going to do that anymore. We're not going to do that anymore. That's going to be a thing that someone did one time, but we don't really have the tools even to run anymore. It's very intensive and it's fascinating and I love doing it. And then at some point you realize, oh my God, what am I doing? This isn't real life. This is not about sustaining the people around me. So I guess I'm trying to expose myself to ways of living off the land, not living off the land in the sort of like run away to the woods and be a prepper type thing, but like to do it together. You gotta have people around you to do it, or else it doesn't work.
Mycelial networks. Right?
Yeah.
Is that what? You guys are mushroom people. Yeah, I guess that's like, I'll be honest, like I'm exhausted. I'm a single mom running a nonprofit. I'm like all the things. It's exhausting, and I think our economic system that we're in here, it's set up like that, right? We have to hustle, we have to be competitive, we have to do all these things, and so I'm just like, I think about how, and I see some of us doing it, identifying people that we want to work with, right? Like Mario, like I love, and I love working with Mario, right? I see you over there, Rachel, right? And those of us like uh, identifying these people finding out like what we're good at and what we're not,
Mm.
and like asking each other, what am I good at? What am I offering on the table? And having these conversations um to see like what are our strengths. We don't all have to do everything, and how can we build these things together, and whether that be through I think we're talking realistically about the structure we're in now, right? Like, how do we have our businesses cooperate? How do we build write grants together? How do we build buy land together? How do we do these things, right? Help each other cook food, right? And I think these things are talked about a lot. This isn't a new concept for any of us, but doing it, right? Like you're saying, practicing it is a lot harder than dreaming it. And it requires all of us to, like, we all have egos, right? And we don't like to hear criticism all the time. We all want to do everything, and how do we let go and figure out like how we can make space for each other and to do this, because I don't know any other way, because every other way is exhausting and not sustainable, right? It's not sustainable. So.
Yeah. And I also want to add just to that thought of like expanding that frame beyond just other human being people, right? And like we can also think about making those same relationships with all of our more than human kin that are sharing space.
I want to add something really quickly too, which is that like I found that in the US, the idea of dependency is often like seen as like a toxic thing. And I think the idea that it's toxic is very toxic, because dependency is so important, like all of you have been sharing, and like dependency again, like not just between humans, but with everyone, right? Like, sorry.
No, I just want, I was going to say that what you were saying about that brought up something that I like weirdly had to learn recently, which is that asking people to do something for you, like I basically grew up in such a way that I was like scared to ask people to do things for me, and eventually realized that that's like how people become endeared to each other. They're like, oh yeah, you asked me to do that thing for you and I was happy to provide it for you, and now I feel like we're closer. And it's weird that I have to like tell my parents to do that. They're like, oh, I don't want to ask the neighbor to borrow their tool. And I'm like, you should, because they have it. And then maybe they'll feel like you're a resource for when they need something. And to unlearn such a simple thing it sucks that I have to do that. But yeah, dependence should not be viewed as toxic. And that's like one of the major, just like being, I run other mushroom events, not like this, different kinds, but that I've had to learn it just to make it happen. It's like you have to ask people for what you want, and then they'll feel comfortable asking you for what they want, and like that's how the relationship forms.
And also, like, kind of going back to something Jiapsi was saying earlier, like, by keeping us independent, that's how they make us vulnerable, right? Like, our mental health is affected by it, right? We don't have the dependencies that we should have in our lives, right? Because we're kept away from them. And when you come from like a communal culture, like you really feel it when you migrate to places where independence is held as like the main way of being. And that's why we organize things like this, because like we want to create the communities that like understand that and can depend on each other, right? Like this meal was cooked by the hands of so many people in this room, and like there's all these ways in which organizing can't happen, right? Like New Moon New Moon depends on so many different people and beings, and not to bring it back to New Moon, but like that is kind of why we're here a little bit. But so it's really, I think, one of the most important things about starting this work, if you're starting or continuing the work of community building, is allowing yourself to lean on everyone, right? Human and non-human.
And I want to expand what you were, making the point about like more than human, right? And like how the need for activism is there to be able to have those interactions, because so much of it has been stripped from us, right? Like, like our rivers are dammed and our sidewalks are paved, and there's not insects hitting our windshields anymore because of mass extinctions of die-offs and major ecological fallout, that we're experiencing and that we're living, right? And we're mourning over. And so it makes it really, we're up against stuff, right? And so there's like, yeah, there's the need to collaborate, but there's a need for activism, activating, yeah.
With all that, like, I think we can't afford to not care, especially with climate change being a very prominent concern for everyone's communities all over the world. It's something that we can't ignore, and understanding our relationship to the environment is the solution to either reversing climate change or, like, reducing some of its impacts. One of the things I wanted to highlight too is the Winnemem people, which are from Mount Shasta region. They, I think since 2017 or 2016, they've been organizing the Run for Salmon Journey, which is to call attention to the native salmon population that travels through Shasta, and the declining populations because of the Mount Shasta Dam. And so in the Winnemem Wintu's creation stories, they believe that they came from the springs of those lands, and that the salmon gifted them the ability to speak. And the intention for that was so that they can become the advocates for the salmon. The salmon cannot advocate for themselves. So that is also a really important part with forming that relationship to your land, is because these other forms of life cannot be the Lorax if you got to be the Lorax, and a lot of that has to do with erasure, like there's a lot behind that. Even talking about like Aboriginal people of Australia, because when you think of Australia, you think of white people, and there's a really like harmful history around that as well. But just be mindful of the impacts of erasure and its effects on climate change, and how it impacts your environments. And when it comes to like community building, like in the CLT, my focus is on environment. But in order for the CLT to work and to be efficient, there's people that have financial literacy skills. There's people who have nonprofit skills. There's people who have real estate skills, and all these different things. And we need each other in order to make it effective. Because I don't want to do any of that. I hate it, but I'm happy to come up with a remediation plan, So like we really got to tap into each other's strengths, because that's how we build a stronger community. And tapping into like personal passions, like there's a Japanese word, ikigai, like that's tapping into what your purpose is for your life. How are you using your energy? How are you spending your finite time on this planet? And I really don't want a 9-to-5. I really don't want to become something that I know that I'm not. And so I want to honor my own existence by doing the things that I love, and that's ecology, that's mycology, and all these things.